Welcome back to the Shitty Wiki tutorial. So on today's episode, we're going to be making a settings provider that makes it really easy to consume, set, and manipulate settings without having to deal with database dribble. So on our last episode, we created our setting object, which represents a single setting. It's got a name for the setting, a value, when it was changed, and who it was changed by. And we also created a settings debug page that's going to show us the list of all settings in the database. So let's go ahead and create a table here real quick. Table class table. Once again, we will mock Bootstrap's verbosity on having to tell it that a table is a table. And we're going to create a header. We're going to create a body. Once again, I'm going to mock Visual Studio's inability to handle keystroke errors. We're going to create a row, and in our header we're just going to say setting motherfucker value. This is not the keyboard that I use on a routine basis, by the way, which is why this happens invariably. Changed at and changed by. Now we could dependency inject our database into here, into our constructor, and then just go through all the settings that are in the settings table. Let's go ahead and rename this, since we kind of copied the class from the previous page. And like I said, we could inject our database here, and then in our view model, or rather our view, I could go in here and I could do a for each loop and go through every setting that's in the database.settings collection or table and print out a row. But I want to create a little bit more of a framework real quick. So in our settings class, I'm going to create a new class called settings, which is going to be a class that acts as a container for these settings. And we're going to need a couple things here, so let's create the constructor first. We're obviously going to need a reference to our database, to a database context, and we're also going to need an HTTPContext accessor, because we're going to need the HTTP context in order to figure out who it was that actually changed a setting when a setting gets changed. So, oop, I didn't mean to click that. So let's go ahead and capture those values over here. They can be private, HTTP context accessor. We'll call it context accessor just to be short, and we'll just capture those real quick. All right, and here we're going to have some functions, like we're going to have some GetSetting functions, we're going to have some setSetting functions. But the other thing that I wanted to create was I wanted to create a settings cache. So I'm going to create a private static list of all the settings that are currently in the database. And that way, if a single page needs to pull like 3 or 4 or 5, 6, maybe 20 settings, maybe it has to enumerate through a list of settings. We don't want every single one of those to be a database call. These settings will be changed rarely, and even if they're not changed rarely, we can update the cache when they are changed so that we don't have to constantly be pulling them live from the database. That's going to allow us to do synchronous retrieval of settings without really having too much latency. So let's create an enumerable, an enumerable of setting called settings, which really just points to the cache. And that way we can grab a, let's call it settings cache. Can't call it settings because that's the name of our constructor. And now we can grab a reference to something that we can do a for each over in the event that we do need to get all the settings, like on our settings debug page. So actually, let's go ahead and fill this in real quick right now. So let's just say for each var setting in model.settings, which we haven't put in yet, but we'll get it in a second, settings cache. And we'll say create a row, and for each of these we just want setting name, value, changed at, and changed by. And we want to be able to dependency inject this into our constructor here. So I just want to be able to say settings, and be able to work with it immediately. So let's go ahead and create a public property. Called settings. It just needs to be read-only, so capture that. Tralala. And what is the issue here? It's method group. It's not a method. Oh, you know what? This doesn't know what the fuck it's doing. Settings, cache. There we go. Voila. Okay. So our page is pretty much done. And the only other thing we kind of really have to do is to actually load this cache. We just have to update it. So let's create a function to update the cache called update cache. And this is going to be really easy. You just say cache equals database.settings, and then we just grab the list of all the settings in the database. So on our page here, we will just force a update of the settings cache, settings.update cache. Alright, we have to do two things. The first thing is that if we're going to do dependency inject settings into a page, we need to add that to our startup class. So we're going to do services.addScoped database, just like we did with our IAuth resolver. So that'll allow us to inject that dependency. And the other thing we need to do is we need to actually add this to our database. So let's go into our package manager console, add a migration called settings, tralala. It's going to create a migration, and then we're going to update the database. And when it updates the database, it's going to create that table. And we don't need to index it by name because we're just going to be pulling the entire table into our cache every time the wiki loads or when a change is made. So now let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So we actually, so when I log in here, you're going to see an error. And that is that there's no page named admin settings debug. And you might say, well, there must be a page named admin settings debug because you just loaded it and it took you to the login page. It knew that you needed to be an administrator to get there. Well, the reason for this is actually in a completely different place. In our auth page, we're doing a redirect to page, and this actually takes in the server-side path of a page. So in other words, the file with relative to the project. So instead of doing a redirect page, we actually want to do redirect because the URL that we're returning to is actually a client-side URL. So we wanted to take advantage of our route filter that has the URL that's different from the default. So now if I go to /admin settings debug, it should ask me to log in. And now it has taken us to the actual admin settings debug page. Now we obviously have a different error now. Unable to resolve service for type settings. Now I thought I added that. So let's take a look and see what could be the issue here. Did I not add that? Oh, I added the word database. What the fuck? My bad. That's silly sauce. I don't know how this shit happens. Admin settings debug. There we go. Our raw settings report. So if we look at the database and refresh the tables, we now have a settings table. And if I go ahead and edit what's in here, I could put some settings in here. Let's just put a couple settings in here. So let's put foo. We'll say testing 1, 2, 3, changed by me at 06/2020, and we'll say bar, Roseanne bar, also changed by me at 2020 06/20. And now if I refresh the page, boom. And not only is this pulling these from the database, but it's also storing them in that cache. All right, cool. Let's move on. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create some functions in our settings class here. So the first one is going to be something called GetSetting, which is just going to take in the name of a setting, and we're going to return the actual setting. So if the cache is missing for some reason, we're going to update the cache so that we have a cache. And then we're just going to say return first or default from within the cache of the setting that has the name that we're looking for. And then we're also going to create a get function that actually just gets the value of the setting, and because this gets the entire setting, including all the metadata about it. We're going to create a shorter function here just called get that is going to return the value and only the value of the setting. So we're going to get the setting first, and then we're going to return its value. And if the setting doesn't exist, because this would be null, then we'll return null, and that way we don't run into any errors if we try to get a setting that doesn't exist. Likewise, we want to create a function that sets a setting. So in order to set a setting, we're going to need the setting name, the setting value, who set it, and at what time it was set by. Now, we can put some defaults in here so that these are optional. So actually, no, we can't put a property access in a default value, so we'll do that. Now, the first thing that we want to do is if the setting already exists, we want to get the setting out of the database. Now, we can't do GetSetting because that's just going to get it out of the cache. We want to get it out of the database, and I'll explain why in a second. So we're going to create a function called GetSettingFresh. So this is going to be public setting GetSettingFresh, and this is really just going to be database.settings.first or default, where the name matches the name that we have. And I didn't put any parameters in here, so let's do that. So first we're going to try to get the setting out of the database. Now, if the setting isn't in the database, then we're going to create a new setting, and we're going to give it the name that the function took in, and then we're going to add it to the database, and then we're also going to add it to the cache. And then we're going to say if the value of the setting is not the value that we're trying to set, because if we're trying to set a value that it already has, then there's absolutely no reason to do anything. Nothing has changed. We don't want to update our metadata, and we certainly don't want to make a database call. So we want to be able to use these relatively loosely without having to worry about having a performance hit every time we do it. When we pull them, when we get the settings, we're pulling them out of the cache, so we don't have to worry about making a database call there. And we only really want to update the database if the value is actually changing. So we from the caller of this function, we don't want to have to know that. We don't want to have to do those comparisons every time we want to change something. So if the setting actually has changed, then we're going to update the value, and then we're going to update the time that it changed. So if the time that was passed into this function is default, in other words, they just did name and value and didn't put any of this in, then it's going to be now. Otherwise, if they did specify, and when I say they, I mean we, if we did specify an explicit time, I don't know why we would ever need to do that, but if we did need to retroactively update the time that a setting changed at, then we'll provide that. And likewise, changed by is going to be set to who set the setting, and if it's null, then it's null. There may be cases where the wiki itself changes a setting and there's really not a user that changed it, so that's that. And then we want to save changes to the database and then update the cache. So the reason why I did GetSettingFresh up here was so that the reference of S, the setting that, if the setting already existed anyway, the setting that's going into S is a reference to the EntityFramework entity, and that way I can just change the properties on it and then do save changes. I don't have to delete it from the database and put it back, or do like an update command or anything like that. I just change it and throw it in there, and because it because we're updating the cache as soon as we save it, that'll take care of updating, making sure that the changes are saved in the cache. So that's pretty much it. Now, we're probably not going to use this function a lot because, we would have to pass in who the person is that changed it, and we probably aren't going to do that. What we're probably going to do more likely is this overload where we pass in the name and the value and a reference to an HTTP context, and maybe we also still want to be able to override the time. And then what we'll do here is we'll say HTTP context C is either the context that was specified, if one was specified, or if it wasn't, we're going to use the context accessor. I think I called it context accessor, that was dependency injected. And if one was dependency injected, then we will grab the context off of it. And that still doesn't mean that we have a context, because just because we have a context accessor doesn't mean that the thing that injected this class into it was in the context of a web call. I mean, there might be settings that change as a result of some scheduled task, or maybe from the command line or a WebSocket. Well, I guess a WebSocket would have a context, but I mean, you have to rely on the fact that there may not always be an HTTP context, especially if your application does a lot more than just running a website and returning web pages. So if someone does try to call this overload of the function without an HTTP context, we're going to return an argument exception and say no HTTP context could be determined. And that way we know something is wrong and we have to fix it. And at this point, then we can just call the other set function. We'll say set name value c.user.identity.name and the time it was set at. And if we really want to be safe, we can put some Elvis operators in there so that we don't dereference null if for some reason. I've never seen the user object not point at something, even when there's no user that's authenticated. But let's just do that just for a kick. Now, like I said before, these settings might be complex objects. They might not just be strings and numbers. They might be entire blobs of JSON. So we're going to create a static class to help with our JSON serialization shit. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some common settings so that everything uses the same set of serialization settings. So this is going to be called JSONSerializer settings, and let's import this from Newtonsoft, and this can be a read-only property, and we're going to create a static constructor. Go JSON waterfalls. So let's create some new settings, and the only two things I really want to say here are no value handling is ignore. So in other words, if we create a JSON blob from an object and some properties don't have values, we're just not going to include them. That's going to, reduce the size of the database, make it easier to print. And then likewise, on the way in, when we're deserializing them, if someone left out a property that is on the object that we're deserializing to, we're just going to ignore that, and it's just going to be set to null. And then we're going to create two functions to make it really easy to import and export things to the JSON format. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say to JSON. So any type of object that we have in our entire project, we want to be able to say something.toJSON. So we're going to return JSON convert.serialize object on that item with those settings. And likewise, we want to be able to do the inverse. If we have a string, we want to be able to say string dot something to convert it to an object. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to do 2t. So what this is going to allow us to do is basically say any string. Like for example, let's say this was JSON. I could do .to, and then I want to convert that into a, I don't know, like a page. And now suddenly that function would convert that into a page. So return JSON convert .deserialize object to t or of t from that string with those settings. And that's all we need to do there, and we're going to use this in a second. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create another get overload up here. So right here under our gets, we're going to say public t get of t, and we're going to take the setting name in, and we're going to say, let's first get the value of the setting, so whatever's stored in the database, and then we're going to say if the value is null or the value is empty string, then we're going to return default. I'll explain that in a second. Otherwise, value.toT. Alright, so the first thing, return default. You might say, well, why don't I put return null there? Well, I can't put null there because t might not be an object. T might be like an integer, and you can't assign null to value type. So we use the word default, which means the default value for whatever t is. If it's a number, it'll be 0. If it's a date time, it'll be, I don't know, like 1900 or whatever I think it's actually January 1st of 01 or something. But if it is an object, it will return null. Second thing is over here, this is kind of convoluted. We could say string.is null or empty. But I get really tired of typing is null or empty. I do a lot of string manipulation throughout my projects. So typically, and you'll like this, typically I have a extension method, and I call it Nill. Yep, that's my name, and that's exactly where it comes from. Probably 14 or 15 years ago, I wrote this Nill function to basically make string is null or empty much shorter. And then when extension methods came out, oh, this needs to be a boolean. And then when extension methods came out, I made this an extension method. So that means that I can, basically take anything that's a string and say, oh, is it nil? Not null. Null would be null, but if it's nil, that means it's either null or it's empty or it's not there. We could say not there or not populated, but this is pretty straightforward, right? So string is null or empty x, great. So let's go back to our settings. Change this to value.nil, and we're good. And now let's create the inverse of that with a set. So we want to be able to take in an object and just set it in the database, right? So now we can create an overload where we do set of t, and we take in an item and also a name, and let's also take in all this other shit that we want. And then we can just pass this off onto that other function and just say, okay, well, it's the name, it's the item.toJSON, the context, and the time. Now that's fine and dandy, but I think the function overload that I'm going to wind up using the most is going to be this one, where I just take in an object, any object, and I do when I call this overload, and we send it the item, and instead of asking for a name, we're going to use the item's type as a name, like that. So if this is like, let's say it's password policy, it will convert it to JSON and store it in the database with the name password policy. And I think that's probably going to be the simplest out of all of these possible variants. But we might need these if we're manually editing, a setting on, like, let's say our raw setting debug page or some shit, I don't know. And we're going to create one last thing. We're going to create a function to populate an existing object with values from the database. So we're going to call it populate, and we're just going to take any old, we'll call it item, And what we want to do here is we want to get the value. So we're just going to do a get on item.getType.name. So again, like password policy. And if the value is not null, then we're going to do JSON convert.populate object with the value that we got. And we're going to use our JSON settings. So that way, if we create, like for example, if we manually create a new password policy object and we want to fill in all the properties with the data from the database, we just have to call this settings.populate on it, and it will grab all of that and know exactly what. All right, now let's go ahead and create some settings. So let's go to our auth class, our auth file rather, where we have all of our authentication shit. And one set of settings that we really need to deal with is, you know, like I keep mentioning, the password policy. So let's create a class called password policy. And in here, let's create two properties for starters. We'll call it min password length and obviously max password length. And now let's go ahead and create our actual settings page that the admin is going to go through in order to set this shit up. So, as usual, table class table, and we're going to create a header and a table body and a row for the header. And up here we're going to say settings, and we're going to say options. And over here, we're going to create a row, and we're going to call it password requirements. And in the cell on the right, so on the left is just going to be, you know, a heading for each group of settings, like in this case, password requirements. And on the right, we're going to have a table of settings. So let's go to our view model, and let's create a password policy called password policy, and let's make it a bind property so that we can bind things to it. And now I'm just gonna paste some of this in here so that you don't have to watch me type it. You've seen me create enough fucking forms, except that is all completely wrong, so I do have to type it. And at the bottom of the table, we're gonna create a cell that spans the entire table and is aligned to the right, and in there we're just going to have a button to save the settings. So button type submit, we got to do our button and our button primary to make it look good, and then we're just going to call it save. That's good enough, save. And then so obviously we're going to need an on post, so we're going to need an I keep typing I async result, it's I action result on post. And basically we need to populate our password policy, and then on post we need to save our password policy. So let's go ahead and create a constructor, and we'll inject our settings. And so now that means we have to have a settings, and then that means that we have to capture our settings, and then on our get, we're going to say password policy equals settings.get password policy. And you know what, let's create an overload where I don't have to specify a name. So let's just do public t get t, and that'll just map to get t type of t dot name. Awesome. And the other thing that we should probably do is we should probably put some rational defaults in here, because this setting is not going to be in our database from the beginning. So let's not say 4, let's say 8, and let's say a maximum of 32 for now. And so this should populate this object up here with our shit. And if this does not... See, what's going to happen here is this is going to return null because the setting doesn't exist. So let's just say get or create. And then that way we can say return this if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then we want to create a new T. And we can't do this because not all T's can be created, so we have to say where T is a class that has a constructor that is trivially constructible. So just so you know, let me just clarify what this means. It means that we're gonna have a get or create function that takes a type of T, no parameters, just a type. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the name of that type, look in the database for a setting with the name of that type, and we're gonna try to get it. If it's there, we're gonna take its value, deserialize it into a new object of that type and return it. And if it's not there, then we're just going to create a blank type, a blank object of that type. In which case, in our password policy, that's when we're gonna get our defaults, our 8 and our 32. So let's go ahead and run this, and we should have a pretty form waiting for us that has an 8 and a 32. What did I do wrong here? Oh, I gotta stub this out. And I also have to change this to get or create. There we go. Let's see what we got. There we go, 8 and 32, perfect. Now let's go ahead and create some logic when we save the settings. Should just be able to say settings.set password policy. And the other error that I just realized was that I never created a form. So form method equals post, and put the entire table inside of that. There we go. Alright, let's go ahead and see if this actually saves to our database now. Admin settings. Go and hit save. Now if I refresh the table, there we go, password policy. And voila. So now if I change this to, like, let's say I change this to 64, hit save, and then I go ahead and I refresh the entire page, it saves. Perfect. Alright, let's go ahead and check in our code. Dun, 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 dun. Where's check-in? I clicked on the wrong item. Part 6. Settings. So that takes us to the end of the video. On the next video, we're going to make these settings even easier to work with. We're going to make them so that we can just dependency inject each individual setting, like in this case password policy. And we're also going to define some more settings and implement them. So if you have a question, comment, concern, any complaints, comment below, like, subscribe, consider supporting me on Patreon, and as always, stay safe. See ya.